Happy Independence Day, everyone. To mark the occasion, here's my review of Xenonauts for PC, Mac, and Linux. This is a real-time strategy and turn-based tactics game developed by Goldhawk Interactive and released in 2014 for PC, Mac, and Linux. And it's a sort of follow-up or spiritual successor, if you prefer, to the old-school XCOM games. And if you're like me and you feel like Firaxis has absolutely no idea what they're doing when it comes to the XCOM series, then that sort of thing is actually very welcome. Of course, this brings up the two main questions that are going to be asked about Xenonauts. First off, how is it as a game on its own? And second, does it manage to recapture that feeling of the old school XCOM games and what made those great? Well, let's go ahead and delve into this thing and find out. Well, as far as presentation goes, there's really nothing to write home about here. It uses a 2D art style, and everything takes place from either a global map perspective or an isometric tactical map perspective. Now, when you're looking at all of the 2D artwork in the global perspective, everything looks mostly fine. The interface is a bit clunky here and there, but for the most part it works out alright. And then when you go into the tactical interface, the interface itself is mostly fine. It's actually pretty intuitive and easy to work with, but the 2D graphics themselves are really not impressive in the slightest, even though they are decently detailed and the animations are generally fairly smooth. Nothing is particularly well detailed, but it doesn't really have to be. This is a strategy and tactics game. It's not meant to be flashy in animations or anything of that nature, so it does make it easier to excuse the graphics for being somewhat lackluster. Slightly less forgivable is the lackluster sound design, where the music in particular is really not noticeable throughout the course of the game. It's a bunch of very simple horror-esque tracks that really just don't do all that much to generate atmosphere for the game. It's certainly not anywhere near as recognizable as something like the music from the original XCOM, for example. So that's somewhat disappointing. It's also a bit disappointing that the sound effects are not particularly great. Gunfire in particular just doesn't sound all that great, explosions aren't very beefy, and it ends up being something that is serviceable, but nothing more than that. And when you put all that together, you end up with presentation that works well enough to be able to play the game and not have any major issues with it, but it's not really going to be all that memorable or interesting either. It's just functional, and for a game like this, where it is a strategy game and a tactics game, that works a bit better than if it were, say, a first-person shooter or an adventure game or something. But here's the thing, even if the presentation is a bit lackluster, what really matter here are the story, or rather very limited amount thereof, and especially the gameplay. The story is little more than set up for the actual gameplay. You play as a multinational military organization that is created during the Cold War era when aliens started invading the Earth. The mission is pretty simple. Stop the aliens by any means necessary. Of course, that's a lot easier said than done when you are fighting a bunch of intergalactic alien invaders with some 1970s technology, which means that you have to get your research up and going as quickly as possible in order to not be at an absolutely massive disadvantage. So the game basically goes as follows. Aliens start invading, and you are woefully ill-equipped for the mission at hand. You barely manage to eke out a few victories here and there until eventually you manage to start to gain the upper hand by getting your technology up to speed, as well as finding out more about how they're attacking you and what you can actually do to stop them. Everything in the game leads up to the final mission, where you go and bring the fight to the aliens this time around, and you actually try to kick them off of the planet for good. And as far as storylines go, it's actually barely even in the game at all. It's one of those things where it's the background objective, and you know what you're supposed to do and why you're doing it, but you don't really care about the particulars except for how you're actually accomplishing your goals within the game itself. This is one of those games where gameplay actually takes precedence over everything else, and that's actually to its benefit, because even when you get to the ending, it's basically a single splash screen that says either you lost and humanity is eradicated, or you win and you've secured the survival of the human race. Good job! So really it's more about the journey than the destination, and what ends up happening is you worry more about the actual gameplay mechanics than you do about anything else. To that end, you have the real-time component of the Geoscape, and then you have the actual tactical combat, which is all turn-based. On the Geoscape, you will be looking out for various UFOs and trying to shoot those down. You will be looking for various crash sites or other mission sites to be able to send your troops out to in order to eradicate the alien threat and, of course, retrieve any sort of technology or rescue people as much as you possibly can. Now, the Geoscape side of things is also where you will be managing your bases. Now, you can build multiple bases throughout the course of the game, but you don't want to do that unless you have the requisite amount of money to do so, and the requisite requisite amount of money to maintain everything, because income is actually a pretty big problem at this if you go later on in the game. In order to not lose funding, you try to complete as many missions and take down as many UFOs as you possibly can, and thus keep your ratings up, while simultaneously trying to manage all of your base finances. This means paying maintenance costs for the facilities themselves, as well as actually expanding facilities to give you more lab and workshop space, among other things of course, as well as managing the actual production of your workshops by making sure you're not spending too much on that, both in terms of money and resources. All the while, you need to worry about hiring your staff, as well as your soldiers, and making sure your soldiers don't die horribly. Which, of course, at the beginning of the game especially, is pretty much guaranteed to happen, so that does become something of a problem. Much like in the original XCOM games, a lot of the strategy actually comes from this particular element, managing all of your bases, making sure you maintain your finances up, and making sure that everything goes smoothly as much as it possibly can anyway. You end up needing to strike a balance between actually being able to research projects as well as produce things in the workshop and not going overboard on your spending, and that's surprisingly difficult to do, at least at first glance, unless you're familiar with XCOM anyway. But here's the thing, the real meat of the game is actually going to be in the tactical combat, which is turn-based and uses a time unit system. What does that mean? Well, it means that every single one of your soldiers has their own set of stats, and one of those stats is the amount of time units they get. Every action requires a certain amount of time units to complete, and that's also based on their stats as well. So you need to be able to balance out the time units and make sure you have enough to be able to do everything that you need to do with that particular soldier at that particular time. Something else you have to keep in mind is that your soldiers really cannot take much damage at all, especially early on in the game where your equipment is just basic Earth equipment. After you've managed to upgrade their equipment and get them better armor and better weapons, they're definitely much more of a force to be reckoned with, but until that time, you are dealing with characters that might as well be made of tissue paper. And their weaponry, when it actually does manage to hit things, is not very effective at all. This means that you have to play it smart when you're in the tactical battles. You have to actually utilize cover, you have to have your characters crouch in order to make themselves less of a target, as well as to give themselves accuracy bonuses. And you really do have to cater their individual loadouts to their own strengths and weaknesses. This may seem obvious, for example, but if a character has a low accuracy stat, do not under any circumstances make them your team's sniper. Because unlike in, say, the Firaxis XCOM games, there's no forced class restrictions here. That's all on you. You decide which loadouts are good for which characters, and while you're probably going to be going off of their stats and saying, okay, well, they have this set of stats, that means that they're going to be better with this particular loadout than this one. It also means that you can be rather flexible with your loadouts and make sure that there's nothing that's not covered when you're actually going out into the field. This makes the prep work almost as important as the actual tactics, and when you're actually in the middle of a fight, it actually pays off dividends to have prepared in advance. Because you never really know what you're going up against until you actually get into the mission, and for all you know, you could be going up against really powerful enemies, or you could be going up against the rabble. It just depends entirely on the situation. But regardless of what you encounter, the prep work is actually there to help mitigate any of the problems that you might experience while you're in the field. Early on especially, you'll run into problems where your guys will basically not be able to hit the broadside of a barn, and every single shot counts, so you want to make sure that they are prepared as best they can in the event that they do screw up. Something else to keep in mind is that this is not like the Firaxis XCOM games where you have to pick an enemy as the target as opposed to a location. Here it actually has location-based targeting, which means that you can actually intentionally aim for something that is not an enemy in order to either cause a chain reaction or to destroy some cover that they're hiding behind or something along those lines. This means that you have tactical options much like you do in the original XCOM games, and it really does help contribute to the XCOM feel. The one thing that does prove a bit problematic for creating that XCOM feel, however, is actually the RNG. When I say your guys can't hit the broadside of a barn early on in the game, I mean it. They really cannot shoot for crap, and pretty much all of their shots are going to go sailing over an enemy's head or way off to the side, meaning that you're probably just going to get your ass handed to you repeatedly throughout the early stages of the game, because this thing can be punishingly difficult on the RNG. It's like they took the difficulty level that XCOM was at and said, you know what, we can make it more difficult. And they certainly did, but at the cost of it being less enjoyable. You see, the original XCOM games actually had quite a lot of difficulty settings that allowed you to really tailor the difficulty to what your individual abilities were. Here you have 4 difficulty settings as well as the Iron Man difficulty option, which is just a modifier for an existing difficulty setting, and the game is pretty much built around the second highest difficulty setting. But even if you do decide to lower the difficulty setting, then you're going to find it actually is still an often punishingly difficult game as far as the RNG goes, at least for your character's shots. Because you have to keep in mind that changing the difficulty settings actually doesn't affect your own soldiers at all, it affects the enemy. On higher difficulties, you're going to find that the enemy's accuracy gets a lot better, you're going to find that their stats are improved, and you're also going to find that the amount of damage they do to you is increased. That's pretty much all the difficulty settings do. The tactics that the enemies exhibit are going to be pretty much the same no matter what you do. So you find that the enemy can be really stupid, but they hit like a freight train. It just depends on how lucky you get. This brings up something important to mention. This was perfectly fine for a game released back in the early 90s when there wasn't much you could do with AI. That doesn't really work so well in 2014 when you expect the higher difficulty settings to be more difficult because the enemies are going to be smarter, not because they just hit harder. There are other problems with the game in general as well, even though it does generally do a very good job of porting the old school XCOM style gameplay to a more modern release. It actually ends up sticking a bit too much to the original formula and doesn't really do enough to differentiate itself from the pack. Other problems include there being a bit too many research projects, which just kind of go about getting you to new technologies in a very roundabout way, and that ends up being a bit frustrating to deal with if you don't actually have the tech tree in front of you so you can actually pay attention to what's going on. Then of course there's also the issue of the air combat, where you'll send out interceptors to take down UFOs, and the system for doing that is either to auto-resolve it, which is what I primarily ended up doing, or to use the actual air-to-air combat system, which is pretty bare bones and consists of you basically giving orders and saying, okay, you're going to attack them aggressively, and that's kind of it. Because let's put it this way, when you're going in and auto-resolving a battle because the combat system is not good enough to actually warrant going for it, then you've got a pretty serious problem on your hands. And the thing is, with the original XCOM games, it was the early 90s, so they didn't really have all that much better that they could reference and say, okay, well, this is why you should improve this. You have to keep in mind that it's been over 20 years since the original XCOM game came out. When it comes to a game like Xenonauts, you want it to actually be a significant improvement on the original formula, not just recycling that formula with more modern graphics and engines. And unfortunately, Xenonauts doesn't really do that. It brings the formula to a modern engine with modern resolutions and such like that, of course, and it is certainly very playable and it works rather well for the most part, but it's not a significant improvement on the original XCOM formula. Now that's not to say that the game's bad or anything, it's certainly not a bad game by any stretch of the imagination. It's just that while the original XCOM game still holds up to this day, it is definitely a product of its time in terms of interface and such. If you have problems with the interface of the original XCOM, then you can always get the OpenXCOM source port to run it in more modern resolutions with some quality of life enhancements, and that definitely does improve the experience of playing the original XCOM. But when it comes to something like Xenonauts, we wanted something that was inspired by the original and definitely uses a lot of the same ideas that the original did, but also does its own thing and improves upon the formula rather than just simply recycling it. Which ultimately means that while Xenonauts is certainly a very solid game that brings the old school XCOM formula into a modern release and does it rather well, it's just that it doesn't live up to its full potential and thus ends up being a mild bit disappointing. Because when it comes down to it, you can still get the original XCOM game and it still holds up very well. Whereas if you play Xenonauts, then more often than not you find that while you're enjoying the experience, you go, well, there's not really enough here to make me want to play this over the original XCOM. Which ultimately means that I'm giving this a 3.5 out of 5. It's still a solid game, and it's worth picking up if you can get it on sale, but it's not the kind of thing that I would recommend over the original XCOM, especially if you can play that with the OpenXCOM source port. What I'm hoping is that Xenonauts 2 actually manages to improve upon the problems that the original game has, and of course improve upon the formula that the old school XCOM games established. Because it certainly has plenty of potential to do so, but we'll just have to wait and see on that. But until next time, Thanks for watching.